Today we're going to cover perhaps the most infamous rifle of the Great War. A Russian original that, despite constant criticism, would serve for nearly a century. Hi, I'm Othais, and this guy is the Russian 3-line rifle, year of 1891, more popularly known as the Mosin-Nagant. I'm sure many of you are at least somewhat aware of it, but let's go ahead and take it over to the light box. Weighing in at 9½ pounds and with an overall length of 51½ inch, this is a very large and heavy rifle, although not all that unusual for the time it was adopted. It chambers the 7.62 by 54mm rimmed cartridge and feeds 5 of those things from a stripper clip into its single stack box magazine. Now, I am going to anger a lot of you right off the bat by saying I have a deep love for the Mosin-Nagant. I'm not sure that I have an appreciation for it, though, and I'm sure that many of you already have very strong notions about just what this gun represents in terms of shooting performance and history. But we still need to know where it comes from, and if you learn to appreciate how it came to be, I think you start to understand why it is the way that it is. And it can be a history lesson and a reminder of the past without necessarily being your favorite shooter. So with that in mind, let's go build up some contextual history. This is the Berdan II, a 10.75mm bore black powder single shot rifle. It was designed by US inventor and marksman Hiram Berdan. To the Russians, it was known as the 4.2 line rifle. Now, a line is an old Imperial Russian unit of measurement. It represents 2.54mm. And while we're talking Imperial measurements, they also use something known as the R-shin, roughly like a meter, although this comes out to 71.12 centimeters a pop. Those will be marked on the rear sights of these guns. Now, of course, if we're back at the Berdan, I don't need this guy for now. Instead, let's talk a little bit about the 1870s, because this is a period when the first really reliable repeating rifles are starting to appear. I mean, they're not anything near what we're going to see in World War I, but they have magazines, they feed from them. You know, Swiss are getting into it pretty good. But for the most part, a lot of nations are sort of holding back. They're still kind of concerned about the idea of arming men with a magazine rifle because the thought process is they're going to put it to their shoulder, they're going to see the enemy, they're going to get that panic in them, and they're just going to start shooting and working the bolt and shooting, or even if it's not a bolt, it's a lever or whatever. They're going to shoot and miss and shoot and miss, and they're just going to burn ammo. And at this time, siege warfare is still a thing, and you got to pack in everything manually, either by person or by animal. And so a lot of armies really kind of settle in and try to do as much damage as they can while running down the clock. The clock on food, the clock on ammunition, the clock on water. That's where, you know, it's like small scale attrition. This is where a lot of battles are won and lost. So nobody wants to waste ammo. They want one shot, one kill. That's going to change for Russia about the time of the Russo-Turkish War. Now, in particular, we're talking yet again about the siege of Plevna in 1877. Here, the Ottomans used a combination of Martini rifles and Winchester lever-action repeaters. They would carefully aim and shoot the single loaders at long range, and they would set their sights using pre-designated markers. This made for very accurate fire. But once in a while, the enemy would get too close, and in order to drop them, they'd drop their single-shot rifles and pick up the Winchester repeaters, emptying the magazines as fast as they could. This effectively prevented the Russians from making critical breakthroughs. And while they would ultimately win the siege, they suffered extreme casualties in the process, and it took longer than they expected. Now, you guys have heard me talk about Plevna plenty, and that's because a lot of European powers took this example to push them in the direction of a universal repeating rifle for their troops. Now, what they wanted was the ability to shoot at long range, just like with those Martinis, and still pump rounds in an emergency like the Winchesters. So what they ultimately would do is a lot of them would adopt single-shot rifles with magazines with a cutoff. So the idea is that you have a magazine in reserve, and then your officer can call, oh, good God, they're right there, open the magazine, dump the magazine, halt the threat, then we will go back to single shot. And in this way, you could waste ammo in those precious moments when it was acceptable to waste ammo, but not all the time. It's not a bad concept, certainly, but we know that it would start to fade over time. I really don't have to go explaining single shot versus repeating. We've done that in a million different episodes. So instead, let's talk about what the Russians did with this information, because they're the ones that experienced Plevna. They're the most directly impacted. So they took the shots from those Winchester repeaters. They would naturally be right at the front line of adopting a repeating rifle, right? You guys don't know Russia. Instead, they would just focus on trying to get their rate of fire up without actually having to reinvent the gun or add a magazine, because that just sounds expensive. Instead, they came up with different cartridge holders and bandoliers and like weird attachments to the rifle itself to see if putting cartridges on the rifle would mean you could get them to the chamber faster. I'm not kidding. This is like their approach to, we just got laid out by Winchester repeating rifles is, what if we just put the single cartridges as fast as we could? Like, just, hurry up. Obviously, this did not really work, but it did delay progress for several years until someone got fed up with it and actually started pushing them in the right direction. That would be the Chief Artillery Director, Sofiano. He got plenty fed up and took the helm. He would, in 1881, start pushing for the native development of a magazine system to fit to the existing Berdan rifles. Now, the key word there is native. That is a domestically, not necessarily invented, but adapted system. So the Russians didn't expect that they were just going to invent their way out of this with a brand new whatever, but it'd be nice if they did. So they did have some people in country who had magazine ideas, like everybody does, but they also were willing to look outside the country for inspiration. But the one thing is, they weren't just going for a wholesale adoption of an outside idea. They wanted to fit it custom to their Berdan rifle, which no one else was really using. I mean, people were buying them from Russia, but no one else was producing their own Berdans necessarily, except for to sell them to Russia. Does that follow? So they had to, by default, work on this in-house to some degree, or at least make some custom decisions. That is key because it's going to set up the Russians to have their own internal development for the first time for small arms, and that is what ultimately leads to their ability to produce this gun today, for better or worse. But anyway, this starts with surveying the field and looking at what magazine systems are actually out there. So in a few years' time, you'd start to see things like the Lee, Kropatschek, and Winchester Hotchkiss come cruising through the Russian arsenal system. They were explored by the local smiths and engineers who soon acquired a taste for their own ability to invent and refine existing designs. This atmosphere, again, would prove critical to creating their own culture of arms development. Now, at first, this was all sort of, one thing at a time. They just sort of were sampling. There wasn't really a plan for how to turn this into a meal. And so 1883 rolls around and the government's going, we should take this kind of seriously. So they want to put together a commission for the testing and acceptance of a new rifle. Now, this thing is going to change names so often that I don't want to bother naming it. Like, as I was going through the history, it just seems like it would spin off another subcommittee that then just sort of became the committee. And it's not that interesting of a detail. But the way I know it's the same committee every time is they kept putting the same guy in charge of the whole thing. So there's really one name that sort of sticks to the controls and guides the way for this process of organizing all of these engineers, inside and outside inventors, that sort of thing. That would be the then Colonel and later Lieutenant General Nikolai Ivanovich Sheehan. He was one of the few men in Russian service to have experience as an arms designer. And while I think he deserves a bigger bio, we're going to be running on limited time for this episode, so I'm going to invite you to look him up yourselves. What's important is that he would be the arbiter of Russia's rifle program, often challenging his inventors and engineers to mix and match concepts of the day, constantly questioning every design, and making certain Russia would adopt a reliable rifle. Try not to judge him too harshly. He was working within the Russian imperial system. Overall, I think his efforts were very well done, considering what he was working with. So, this man, with the formation of the new commission, sets out a two-stage set of goals. Not two goals, but two stages. Stage 1, find a magazine system for the Berdan II that allows for simple conversion of the existing rifles. If that does not work, then we default back to stage 2. Now, by the way, the fact that you would have a fallback plan is very advanced for Imperial Russian adoption at that time. Now, part 2, if it doesn't work out, then you need to pick an overall new service rifle with magazine function. Now, when you have a standing army as big as the Russians do, and you're looking for a new rifle, all sorts of people will come to bat. And we've already listed some of the magazine systems that we saw, but we're also going to hear some names that are more familiar, like Mannlicher, and down to things like Vitali or Bertoldo or Milovanovic or something like that. Like, a lot of these guys came to play, along with some names you've never heard from the Russian camp. These are local guys that are just trying to put forward their best idea, and they're usually working within the arsenal system already, which is how we're going to find our hero today, but we're not ready for him just yet. So the whole thing is very informal. You would submit your rifle with magazine design. Presumably, if you want to be at that stage 1 goal, you would submit a Berdan conversion, but you could also go for goal 2, hedging that there wasn't going to be an acceptable winner for goal 1. So you submit your gun, and they do a 100-round impression test. Now, this is going to be that 4.2 line black powder cartridge. And if that goes well, then you get to kick up to like a 3,000 round sort of endurance test to really give an impression of the gun. And as the inventor, you could be there. You don't have to be there. They'll give you notes. You can take those notes and redesign the gun and resubmit it all over again. You can just keep resubmitting and making changes. So that means that there's a lot of turnaround very quickly, which is a good thing. But it also means that there's not a lot of detail for me to give you because there's just a myriad of things going on in a brief 1 to 2 year period as people really start to try to adapt the Berdan. But ultimately, by 1884, we're seeing a clear leader in this sort of category of Russia's first repeating rifle. That would be the Krasnevsky, which, by the way, I still don't speak Russian. This was a Berdan II bolt system paired with a Kropatschek-ish tubular magazine. It was affordable, functional, and on the straight path towards adoption when it exploded. Twice. Now, as a man who has exploded 2 rifles before, I can tell you that I'm not impressed by Italian Vetterlis converted to 6.5, and I'm sure that the Russians weren't too happy with 2 of their demonstration rifles also exploding, although these were done out of battery. As a matter of fact, we've talked about this possibility before and sort of dismissed it, but in this one case, it was actually true, and I imagine that it had a lot to do with the configuration of the ammo, the type of primer, and the shape and handling of the follower and the tube. There's a lot of detail that goes into this sort of thing. It was a tubular magazine chain detonation. Tip to primer, shaking the gun around, 1 bullet slammed into 1 primer, and pop goes your magazine tube. It actually happened. It actually happened twice in a number of weeks. And so, with those 2 incidents, well, the committee was like, no thanks. We don't want to do anything with this. We're done. No more underbarrel tubular magazines. No more in-a-line tubular magazines. The chain detonation concept is just too worrisome for us. Now, we know from other guns like Kropatscheks and, well, Lebels are built on Kropatscheks, basically everything Kropatschek in terms of military bolt-action rifles, that you can have a safe enough, even with Spitzer cartridges, tube magazine. You have to have hard primers. You have to have rims so that they don't go tip to primer. And yeah, you can still shake them up, but it doesn't seem to happen, except for apparently Russians were very good at it. I suspect very sensitive primers. Anyway, tube magazine off the docket. Goodbye. Now, the good thing about that, though, is that it brought to light a lesser-known Russian design that had been submitted that is now, despite not being nearly as good in terms of feed and fit and finish, is actually looking nice because it doesn't have chain detonation risk written all over it. Now, this was designed by one Sergei Ivanovich Mosin. Son of a retired second lieutenant from Russian peasantry, his mother would actually pass away giving birth to his brother in 1852. He entered the Mikhail Military Academy at age 12, and in 1867 moved over to the Alexandrovskoy Military High School in Moscow. In 1870, he was assigned to the artillery and entered the Mikhailovskoy Academy. He would graduate in 1875 and was sent over to the Tula Arsenal. This posting allowed him to stay close to his ailing father and introduced him to a number of foreign military designs that came through for testing or modification. He rose quickly through the ranks and by 1880 was already head of the tool shop. His design was another 4.2 line black powder rifle, introduced in 1884. Instead of an underbarrel tubular magazine, it used one set in the stock at an angle, preventing chain detonations. The stock styling actually comes from the Berdan, and those holes in the stock, well, they were actually from the existing Berdan Dragoon variant. While serviceable in many ways, it wasn't as favored because the bolt was new made. That means no reusing the existing Berdan rifles. It locked on the bolt handle, which was set further to the rear of the receiver than the Berdan, but it was an attractively simple design with a separate bolt head and cock-on open action. Alright, I'm going to go off script for one moment because normally I research everything. I count on other researchers. I don't like making claims. I don't like theories without proof. But there's something about the Mosin that has bugged me for a very long time, and I can't unsee it. I believe that Mosin took ideas primarily from these three US rifles: the Evans, the Chaffee-Reese, and especially the Winchester-Hotchkiss. Now, I could be absolutely wrong about this connection. I have no hard research for it. I just can't not see it. And to be fair, if I'm right, it's not like this is a ripoff. I mean, the final Mosin guns, even these early Mosin guns, are far enough away from the Winchester-Hotchkiss as to be much different than, say, the Mauser and the Springfield 1903. Mosin's making his own gun, even if he's inspired by somebody else. It'd just be nice to know if he really was inspired by the Winchester-Hotchkiss. Alright, so he has his model 1884, which I've already shown you, and there's like 4 big problems that stand out with it, but otherwise it's pretty impressive. Now, those problems are, technically, the way his stock is set up, you could still maybe get a chain detonation. It's not super likely like it is with a tube, but like a linear tube, but this angle, even with the rims, it makes people nervous, okay? Number 2, how do I explain this? It feeds from the rear. You load your first cartridge, you go to extract it. It needs to hit an ejector of some sort, but there's none in the gun. Instead, it uses the rim of the next cartridge to act as the ejector. The problem with this is you eventually have a last cartridge, and when you try to eject that, you have to reach down and thumb it out. People don't like sort of changing what they're doing just for one cartridge. It makes things very weird. All right, number 3, the buttstock is weaker because you've put a hole in it. All right, that's just going to be an inherent problem with having a buttstock feeding magazine. And then last, the cocking piece on the bolt itself, because this is not the Berdan, we have to judge the bolt. The cocking piece doesn't have any sort of overtop cover to prevent things from getting in between it and the bolt body, which means you could potentially get something in there, pull the trigger, and then the cocking piece won't be able to fall all the way. That's a big problem. So Mosin would work up an improved model 1885. Now we'll see a 2-piece stock. Most significantly, it had a 2-rail system for the stock to control the feed of the cartridge as the bolt was worked. This 2-rail system greatly resembles the Chaffee-Reese. The tube was left partially exposed and formed the bearing surface during recoil. This configuration was definitely tried before in the Evans rifle. This should have made it stronger, but it actually turned out to be a little bit weaker this way. About 800 of these things were produced for extended testing. The only severe problems were out-of-battery detonations. Now, that problem was actually really common because this is a double feed out-of-battery that they're afraid of. We saw this with the Gewehre 88 and basically any gun that doesn't have a controlled feed from the magazine to the chamber. That means that the cartridge doesn't lip the extractor the moment it comes out of the magazine. Instead, it lips the extractor after you've already chambered the round. So that means that you could conceivably mostly chamber a round, bolt back, having not lipped it with the extractor, not notice you've left a round in there, feed another round, tip to primer, bang. Okay, that's the sort of fear that we're having. I also saw some illustrations that maybe there was an issue with sort of hanging extraction and then the rim of an extracted case being able to be accidentally rammed back into a primer. I'm not sure of exactly what they were doing to cause these out of batteries. I just know it had something to do with a double feed of either an empty case or another live case. Regardless, Mosin would actually correct this issue in his 1887 gun, which I am not even going to show you because that gun is irrelevant because basically arms technology just goes and changes that same year. And we've talked about this before, but let's just get a quick recap. The 1880s were absolutely nuts for firearms development, so let's see some examples here. Germany had a center-fire black powder large-bore single-shot rifle in the Mauser 1871 that lasted over a decade, but by 1884, they were going for this new repeater concept. So you get the 7184, a large bore black powder repeater. Now next up, research revealed that smaller diameter bullets moving faster were a lot better and easier to truck around. The problem is black powder made a mess in those tight bores. Let's borrow this design from neighboring Austria as an example. This was actually adopted by the Portuguese. The Kropatschek features a small bore black powder cartridge and tubular magazine. But right at that same time, Austria-Hungary avails another revolution in the Mannlicher 1886, which is actually still large bore. They hadn't gone to the small bore thing, but its magazine uses an end block clip, allowing them to load an entire magazine in one quick go. That's right, they could just preload these things and just shove the whole thing in the gun, boom, rapid loading. So that means that by 1886, the most advanced rifle you can have is a small bore, compressed black powder, repeating rifle that feeds off of an end block or a charger, because the Vitali system that we've seen before was already out there. The Mauser stripper clip, not quite, but the charger's pretty close. So anyway, packet loading, like all the ammo at once, small bore compressed black powder repeater. That is the ideal in 1886. And by that number, I know a lot of you know where we're going, but just hold on to this for one moment. Because if the Russians had been fast adopters, then they would have gotten sort of close with this, and the best they had at that moment was, well, Mosin's 1885. Now, in order to get it to a small bore, they actually did some experiments. They did make a 3.15 line cartridge that comes out to 8mm, and they tried running it in the Mosin 1885, and it failed. It just couldn't take the pressure. It was a little too heavy of a hitter. They were, trying to get that speed up in addition to getting the bore down, and it was no good. So they would start putting some effort into developing a rifle that could handle a small bore compressed charge, but they really didn't want to pair that with the magazine system. It got spun off into its own little side thing, and it wasn't a huge priority. So that means that Russia wasn't that worried about fully loading the magazine. They weren't that worried about compressed black powder and small bore. They were still going to stick to 4.2 line, and if they'd been any faster, this would have been their final gun. That would mean spending a lot of money and tons of manufacturing time on this gun right here. And instead, well, they delayed as usual, penny pitching till the end, and it kind of worked for them this time, because the very next year, guess what the French dropped? The Lebel 1886 with its smokeless 8mm cartridge. The world of firearms development changed overnight. This cleaner burning, faster shooting powder meant lightning fast small bore ammunition was finally possible without all that horrible after effect, and it allowed for all sorts of previously impossible mechanisms to function without clogging full of black powder fouling. So with that, I don't need to cover Mosin's 1887 rifle, because it was just a refinement of the previous one, and now all that technology is out of date. It's time to move to smokeless powder for certain. Now, that means Russia's got to get moving. They are 2 generations behind, repeater and smokeless. Mosin got back to work and introduced an upgraded form of his rifle in 1888. This one now chambered that smaller bore 3.1 line cartridge, and thankfully did not explode. That's because he added rear symmetrically locking lugs to the bolt, which also now has a distinct French flare, and if you take note, he's included that cover for the cocking piece that's going to prevent muck from getting in there and causing it to not go off when you want it to. Now, this gun is pretty cool, but it suffers one problem, and a problem that's been with it the entire time, almost, which is that stock feed, that feed from the rear. You open the back of the gun, shove ammo in there, close it up. This is cool on some old 22s. This is not something that you want in a military rifle, because first of all, in the beginning, it wasn't a controlled feed, chain detonation, blah, 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 blah. After that, Mosin improves it by having these 2 shaped rails. I don't want to go into animating this, but they alternate when you work the bolt in order to shove ammo forward and then hold it where it belongs. So it's just boop, 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 shoving ammo forward. There's a problem with that, though, which is that if you partially load the magazine, you're going to, you know what? Okay, I think I'm getting a little confusing with this. Let me get a visual aid. So I'll just get this rifle out of the way. I do not have a rear loading rifle with a controlled feed, but I do have something equivalent enough to get the concept across. I have these penguins. So let's see if we can get a closer look. All right, so let me, that should be pretty good. Now this is a highly technical device, but I want you to imagine that this is the rear of the magazine, You have all these positions in which ammo can fit under a controlled feed. And then up here, oh, I'm going to knock the whole thing over, guys. Up here, barely view, patented plastic pokey hand. Up here, boy, that's really not showing up, guys. Okay, this is where the chamber is. So we get out of our magazine up here, and then it goes in the chamber. Now, this is a bit cooler than a gun because it then comes back around and loads itself. This is sort of the infinite shooter, but just ignore the slide part. I just think it's fun. I have taken this thing apart, by the way, because I found out after we got this for the show that it plays a really annoying song at maximum volume no matter what you do. So I cut the wires. All right, so we'll turn this on. And now imagine I'm working the bolt, all right? I'm working the bolt, the ammo starts feeding in. If I load a partial mag like this, obviously I don't have enough penguins for the entire rifle. Well, I gotta keep working the bolt until they all come back around. So if I set this up again, let's, this guy's lazy, all right? So I load 3 rounds, okay? So we'll get those in the gun. 1, 2, 3. Now imagine I manually loaded them. I didn't work the bolt, okay? But I could have had however many rounds more. I'm not really good at conversions of penguins to rounds. That means I got to keep cranking the bolt until all my penguins are lined up just so, with 1 penguin at the top. There we go. Right there. That's what we want. We want red penguin. Then we're ready to put it on our back and go into war. And if we mess that up, when we go to work our bolt in a moment of crisis, we're going to go, all right, work the bolt once. Yep. Nope. Nope. There we go. Now I'm ready to fight. I just like that part. Okay, so I think you can see why this was not going to be a very popular system for the battlefield. So yeah, no more butt loaders. I want to point out I am showing you Mosin designs because we know that's the direction we're going. There's a lot of other things that are being tested. Lots and lots of different ideas are being passed around. It's just that I've sort of gone backwards and with hindsight picked out the things we want to pay attention to. I'm not going to list everything the Russians were playing with because it was all sort of ad hoc, unlike other trials programs where we tend to see whole rifles being submitted, concepts are being explored. So Russia's in a big hurry at this point. It's 1888, they're 2 steps behind, and they're really wigged out by the cartridge more so than the magazine. They're still not convinced that repeating rifles are all that much faster than single shots. They'd prefer to have one, but they know they are drastically outranged by 8mm Lebel, and any army that adopts a smokeless cartridge like that, well, look, Russia could brute force their way through not having repeating rifles. They have enough men that they could just field double the men and double their fire rate. They can't double their distance without actually getting a new cartridge. Does that follow? So, in order to speed this whole process up, they actually do something kind of smart. They split it in half. They start 2 programs, one to select the rifle and the other to select a magazine to fit that rifle. Now that means you have to leave your rifle sort of generic, but reasonably you can fit a lot of magazines to a lot of different actions. And they really need to get around to ammunition, barrel, and bolt first. So there's a second stage to this as well, which is that if we get caught with our pants down and we don't have the magazine, but we do have the action figured out, we can at least start churning out single-shot smokeless powder rifles and defend ourselves with that. It won't be ideal, but it would be better than churning out a bunch of black powder single shots or black powder magazine rifles. And in fairness, that's actually quite smart. So again, everything's split in half. We go into development of single shots. We go into development of magazines that can then be paired to those single shots. That means that Mosin's last design gets stripped of its magazine and is otherwise reassembled for its merits as a single shot rifle. Also, this thing's starting to look kind of familiar. Anyway, around this time, Russia would purchase a sample Lebel and 3,000 rounds of ammunition, but it turns out the barrel was defective, so they had to get another. Basically, this wastes 6 months of their effort. Once ready, the commission would clone the barrel, bolt, and rear sights to speed things up in terms of their research of a cartridge. This effort would be guided by Captain A.N. Zakharov, who served as lead designer for a series of trials rifles. The goal was an 8mm cartridge similar to the Lebel, although hopefully not as hurried. It should huck a bullet at about 2,000 feet per second. With this in mind, Zakharov would get to work. Now, mostly he would be an ideas man, using engineers to get the final products through. Initially, it was a single-shot rifle that cloned the Lebel bolt and barrel, likely in a familiar stock. They then merged in Berdan bolt features and swapped the rifling from left to right hand, realizing the 8mm level cartridge was kind of bad dimensionally. They smoothed it out in favor of their own 8mm design. Again, that is a 3.1 line caliber. They had some problems with bullets striking the rear flat of the barrel. At first, they tried a tipping cartridge guide, but this would give way to a feature from Mosin's mind, a bowl-shaped ring ahead of the breech to guide the bullet into the hole. It necessitated rounding the front locking lugs, though. They would also simplify the Lebel bolt, ditching the need for a screwdriver to get that thing out of the action. And this honestly just seems to come from the Mosin side of things again. It included a spring-loaded left side bolt stop, the trigger was in the Prussian style, much like the Mauser 1871, and the rear sight was taken from the Lebel, but the notch and the front sight post were taken from the Berdan. Now, as you saw, Mosin's contributing to the overall ideas. This is not necessarily a competition. I mean, yes, you want the majority of your ideas to go through, and you'd like that recognition, but it doesn't mean that nobody's on the same team. This is a community effort on the Russian part. They're all Arsenal personnel, and they all want Russia to get the best possible rifle. Now, with that in mind, Mosin still had his own unique ideas, and he didn't necessarily appreciate everything that was going into the commission rifle versus what he thought would be ideal, and that means that he was pushing his own designs at the same time. Let's check in on what he was doing. This looks a lot like his previous rifle. Again, it has a cloned Lebel barrel, but he's ditched the screw and the bolt stop for a unique snag hook. This would be turned to release the bolt from the receiver. Big changes here on that bolt, by the way. The locking lugs are now on the bolt head, much stronger. Also, Mosin incorporated his own bowl thing. You can tell this because the lugs are rounded off at the front on this gun. Also, note that extension on the underside of the cocking piece. Someone is trying to prevent out-of-battery rotation. Now, we kind of talked about that when we did the Gewehre episode, which is that if your cocking piece is back in certain rifle designs, or, well, honestly, very few rifles don't have this feature by the time we're getting into the 1880s, 1890s, but if the cocking piece is back, there is a chance of turning it without some sort of preventative measure and partially decocking out of battery, and then when you try to go forward, it'll jam, scratch up the wood, whatever. In Mosin's case, he just added a simple finger of metal that meant that if you tried twisting on the thing, it wouldn't be able to spin very far because of the notch in the receiver. That's all it is. Now, on something like the Gewehre, they don't have an out-of-battery prevention, but they also don't have any grasping grooves on the cocking piece. You're not meant to manually recock the bolt on that gun. On the Mosin designs, well, yeah, they have a thing for you to grab so that if you light strike or something, you can recock it and just try again. In doing that, you have a very high probability of rotating the cocking piece if you are able to. So this is a good feature to add to the gun. Now, honestly, at this point, Mosin's design is starting to look like a whole rifle, minus a magazine, of course, but we're still investigating the single-shot side of this experiment. Maybe things are kind of settling down. Maybe we're getting towards a final product for Russia. Nah, Sheehan has another idea. During the Commission's big meeting in the summer of 1889, he proposes a new change. Instead of the 8mm or 3-point line bullet, let's go smaller, down to 3-line flat, or 7.62mm. Now, this is not a horrible idea. The smaller, lighter bullet would reduce the stress on the locking system, and it would be easier to get moving faster. Add that 30 caliber splits the difference between all those 6.5/7mm experimentals we're seeing out there and the bigger 8mm Lebel, and it's not a bad compromise cartridge. With some work, this would become the 7.62 by 54mm cartridge that we sort of know today, albeit this one was round-nosed, as was vogue in the time. Spitzer would come later. In the same meeting, a number of requirements would appear. That's the 3-line cartridge, along with symmetrical locking lugs mounted on the bolt head, and those lugs were not to be used as a bolt stop. You know, I bet somebody wished they had laid down that rule for Charles Ross. There would also be many more requirements for the magazine, but I'll get there when we get there. Also at this time, the Russians knew that they were going to have 3 separate rifles. The first being what would be the 1891, a long infantry rifle. And then the second and third are going to be very similar. They're going to be a Dragoon and a Cavalry/Cossack. Those two guns we're actually going to talk about in the next episode. I have more than enough to talk about in this one. Now, end of 1889, the Russians finally have their smokeless powder ready, and they're determined to go ahead and get this process moved right along. In February of 1890, the Commission would reveal another single-shot rifle, much like the last, but now with a new 3-line cartridge, and with a better proportioned receiver and bolt setup. Plus, the rear sight is dovetailed instead of just soldered on. Looking at the bolt, we can also see that they've now borrowed Mosin's out-of-battery extension. Again, he was also part of the team working on this gun, in addition to his own. Now, before we go any further, just a reminder, again, magazines are being developed at this exact same moment, separately, so they're happening consecutive to this. For now, let's keep with the single shots. Mosin's response to the Commission is this, a very familiar looking rifle. By this point, the magazine trials forced a single receiver pattern, so Mosin adopted the use of the Commission's receiver. He did, however, keep his old bolt, but made some improvements. First, the guide rail was lengthened to cover the entire underside of the bolt. This was done to prevent the locking lug from snagging on the rim of the next cartridge. Because that gun is so close to our final product, let me sort of talk about that. So let's get a closer look. Okay, so looking at the Mosin, we have a split bridge receiver. That means that when I lift this guy up, our bolt comes through here with a guide rail, bolt handle, and then we have our nice shroud for the gocking piece, which actually now has another roll as well. Talk about that in a moment. And then while we're out of battery, you can see that this rail here keeps us from being able to turn that cocking piece. All right, this is all making sense. Whether or not you love it, that's a different matter. Now, the bolt is arranged in such a way as to be vertically lugged. All right, so there's our lug sticking up as we go forward. That allows us to not really beef up the receiver. So to get this bolt out, by the way, that rail's serving another purpose. It would snag on the backside of the sear. So if I pull the trigger and work this to the rear, it releases. You can see that mechanism in there. See the release mechanism? And that's going to act on a notch in the underside of this rail. That prevents us from violating the terms of the committee, saying that they don't want anybody whacking on the backside of these lugs. Again, this is important. We saw this with our Ross rifle episode. If your bolt stop actually hits on your lugs, you have a chance of deforming them. I mean, you could also just have really strong lugs, but this is a good option too. Anyway, the rail is really becoming a multi-purpose instrument. I want you to understand why it's here, because in a moment I'm going to talk about why I hate it. But it keeps the cocking piece from rotating out of battery. It keeps us from having to use one of the lugs as a stopping point, as a bolt stop. It also acts as a guide for that lug. So if we are trying to feed rimmed ammunition, there's a chance that as the bolt comes back, it's going to catch on the, well, it would catch here on the lug if it was exposed. But since it's not exposed, it slides right over it. There's a little tiny gap for it to pop right over. We're not going to have any snags or problems. And the reason we want to keep a vertical lug arrangement, by the way, because Mausers and stuff, they don't have this. They have horizontal lugs that then turn up when they go into lock. Well, that's because it makes the back of the gun so much simpler to mill out. We just have to cut vertically into the receiver and drill a round hole. We don't have to go in here and nibble out square shapes and beef up the rear receiver. I mean, if you look at the Mosin, and I know a lot of you have seen this gun, but really look at it for a moment, there's a very small rear receiver section. It's not nearly as built up, and it's much more scalloped out than a lot of other guns. That's because there's not a lot happening back here. With the front locking lugs, all the strength has to be up here. You don't have to have a lot going on in the rear, and that makes it easier to manufacture and consume less metal. So it's not a bad concept. It's just that you end up with some execution problems. More on those in just a second, because I want to sing Mosin's praises just a bit longer, which is that if we put this bolt in, lock her down. All right, we've got our front locking lugs. We've got a support lug here, although that's really not doing much. It's just an emergency thing. And at the rear, on the Berdan rifles, they had a half cock position. You would just pull this cocking piece to a certain point, it would lock in, and then until you recocked it all the way out, no go, right? Well, in this case, that was a little annoying. Half cocks were mostly abandoned by all armies. But the Russians weren't big on attaching a whole other assembly just to act as a safety. They almost wanted to go the French route of no safety at all, but they wanted something. And Mosin actually had a very good idea here. We already are expected to be able to recock this anyway when decocked. So what if we just cock it back a little bit further, turn it so that it rests on the receiver body itself, where we've already milled away some metal to get the size down, and boom, you're done. I mean, look, nothing, right? And then we just cock it back a bit and set it over, and we're ready to go. Now, I know a lot of you know how stiff this is, and you may laugh at it a bit, but realistically, it's no different than like a Swiss Schmidt-Rubin series, because they just pull out not the cocking piece, in this case it's the actual striker, and they turn it into a channel and let it back forward, and it can't go all the way forward. It's the same very simple concept, very simply executed. It's big savings for the Russian military. It's a good idea overall. All right, back to this gun though. So where's the actual problem? And you can kind of see it even in this gun, right? So, and by the way, I know some of you are already trying to read markings and stuff, and you're big on this stuff. Plenty of resources for that I'll link you out, but this one looks to be de-imperialed and Serbian marked. It's going to serve just fine for what we're doing today, though. So you can see as I start to lift her, there's this sort of gumminess to it, and I'm going to tell you it feels almost rubbery. And then I'm going to get this guy back. Again, we're just going to pull that trigger, release that bolt. Very simple mechanism. And where is that coming from? Why do people hate the Mosin bolt so much? And I think you can already sort of see there's just so much play in this thing. That's because the Russians walk the tolerances out to ease manufacture and also sort of prevent it from gumming down very easily. And it's just down to cost savings. But being a little out of spec isn't the real killer of the Mosin system as far as I understand it. As I see it, it's this rail plus all the extra play. So the rail itself, if you notice, is sort of unsupported for most of its length. Yes, it interacts with the cocking piece, but it's retaining the cocking piece. So the cocking piece flexes against it, okay? And it's only really held here. Now, I can take this gun apart further by just letting her forward. That releases our bolt head at the front. Bolt head comes free. Our firing pin is actually fixed down to the cocking piece on the other end. So if we want to go any further for this disassembly, I can recock that to give you a better look. We would have to undo this screw here. So this is all sort of linked unless you actually start unscrewing stuff. We don't need to go that far in. Let's look here. So I'm going to remove the bolt head, and you can see this is the heart of a multi-purpose tool that I think ruins the Mosin bolt. Without it, all right, we would have, let's see if I can even get her to partially reassemble without it. There we go. Without it, we would have a system like this. Let me see if I can recock this. And yeah, see, it won't retain without having been set. Anyway, so we'd end up with a system like this, right? And then when we turned our bolt handle, we would have to have our cocking piece cocked by actually riding in the receiver. It would remove the middle man, all right? I think that would make this bolt a much better. I don't want to go through all the machining to actually try it, but I'm going to tell you, lots of bolts look like this. This is very close to what the Lebel is like, and the Lebel doesn't feel terrible. This rail doesn't actually, let's really look at it for a second. It's not actually attached to the bolt body. It just rests with it and gets turned by the fact that it's squared off with that firing pin. As a matter of fact, I have to decock this to even get that back on there. So it's the squared off hole. So the squareness of this firing pin is what's keeping this rail sort of directed. So it's a little oblong in there, all right? That's a problem because, and I'm trying to explain this visually and not get my hands all in the way, but the cocking piece has to have something to bear against in order to cam back. So these horizontal surfaces here, the linear action of this comes from the fact that we spin it and we don't allow the other thing to spin. So we spin the bolt and we don't allow the cocking piece to spin, and that causes this guy to go back. And that's very stiff, but it's still pretty smooth at the moment, as smooth as I can make it with my hands, right? So in retaining this from rotating, we use this fork here, and you can see those tines are kind of not super rigid. I mean, they're rigid, but they can only be so rigid. They're very thin. There's a lot of tolerance between this and the tines, so it can rattle around on there. There's a lot of looseness between the tines and the body of the receiver. So that's two air gaps that we've already added to the system. And even with those air gaps, now all that sort of all that rotational force that you're resisting is transmitted all the way up here, And it's not resisted by being attached hard to the bolt body, because this just slides in and off and there's a little bit of play there, and there's a little bit of play on the bolt head. No, there's also it going over that firing pin, and again, there's a little bit of play there. So air gap to the tines, air gap from the tines to the inside of the receiver, and then they can sort of yoke up against the receiver. In the meantime, nothing at the front is really preventing the tines from doing that. So, I mean, the receiver wall is ultimately your point of resistance. It's not a very good one. I mean, I can take this thing independently, put it in the gun, and show you I've got plenty of rattle. And so that is why the Mosin bolt feels so dang rubbery. Now, all that said, there's still an additional problem, which is that this lug here has to be able to operate in that notch on the bolt. And I highly recommend that you watch an InRange video. I will link it below. I'll link it in the YouTube overlay or whatever platform you're watching on if it has the option. Go check that video out, because Ian and Carl show very well that a little bit of muck in this gap, done. The rifle will not open. You get one shot, and good luck, Charlie. You got to find a way to toothpick that stuff out of there. That is actually the real Achilles heel of this whole system. So, nobody say I didn't talk through, A, that the Mosin is kind of the worst bolt out there from the World War I era, and B, why? Because you can complain all you want, it's better to know why. And I'm going to tell you, it is all in this part right here. Whew. Okay, rant over. Let's get back to some history. So while I put this back together, I want to start walking you through some of the magazine development, the separate half of this whole thing, because look at all this that's sticking off the bottom of this gun. It's got to come from somewhere, right? This is Mosin-Nagant, one half of the famous Nagant brothers. We'll actually talk more about both of them in detail another day, but for now, just some basics. In 1867, they had licensed the Remington rolling block rifle and built an arms business that would extend into their excellent revolver line. Hint, hint. But now, in the middle of the 1880s, Leon had worked up a new military rifle. This was the Nagant Model 1887. A rocking straight pull, it was kind of like the Navy Lee in operation, but not in execution. The mechanism was actually fairly complex and a little fiddly and pretty vulnerable to dirt and fouling, which is why it would fail in the Belgian rifle trials, losing out to the Mauser 1889. Again, this is another rifle that we have on our near future radar. You know, it didn't even take that long. So, here's something that I want you guys to be aware of going into this mess, which is that the Russians say, we like Nagant's rifle-ish, we're really interested in the magazine, let's do some business here. We want you to send it over to us, but we don't want to get caught with our pants down if we like it. We want to pre-negotiate what it's going to pay out if we adopt this thing. And that's going to be slightly in our favor. We're going to negotiate that now because we don't want you coming up with a price after we've already put a lot of effort into this. So they say to Nagant, and by the way, this might be why the Russians had to go with his design, because I imagine some of the other inventors weren't so keen on this. But anyway, they tell Nagant, here's a contract. And the contract says, look, we'll pay for the trials rifle preps. Here's what the price range is on that. And then in the sub-article 12 or whatever, there's a line that says, if you win this thing, if we adopt your rifle, you get 200,000 rubles, okay? I don't know how many money that is, but it sounds impressive. And so Nagant signs off on this thing, and he says, yeah, okay, if I win the thing, if you adopt my gun, I get 200,000 rubles. You get the ability to produce my rifle exclusively. So you get exclusive license, I walk away from the whole thing with money, we're done, okay? This sounds like a good idea, except for the fact that the Russian process so far hasn't been the wholesale adoption of one particular design. That's going to complicate things. But for the moment, let's get back to that 1887. While overall interesting, it just wasn't going to cut it. Although I kind of suspect that the commission lit on this semi-pistol grip stock, because we're going to see a finger rest appear on the straight wrist Mosin and commission designs after they look at this thing. They wanted a turn bolt, and this is not it. They also wanted a clip loader, and at the moment, this is still not that either, but that's an easy fix. That means in late 1889, Nagant would deliver this. Technically, this was his second turn bolt to be sent over, but the first was such a dud, I'm not mentioning it. The magazine is so simple, it's sublime. Plus, he added the ability to feed from a clip straight into it. But the bolt was really just a version of the work the committee had already been doing. And to be fair, that's by design. They told him, make this kind of bolt. But when they trialed it, they realized he was already outdated compared to their own efforts. Now, this is where I should start walking up a bunch of various Nagant versions, but I'm going to save some time and just hit the high notes. Now, recall that list of requirements from before. Let's go ahead and expand out what they wanted from their magazine rifle. A reliable feeding magazine. No double feeds. It should be positioned for good balance and handling. It should allow for single or magazine fire. Although the Russian mindset for this wasn't that it should have a cutoff, but rather once the magazine was empty, you should be able to toss loosies in. Also, if the magazine broke, it should default to a single shot. And finally, it needs to be paired with a simple, light cartridge clip of some form or another. All right, so like I already said, Nagant is being told by the commission, make this kind of bolt. And they're showing him examples of what they got, I'm sure. So he's sort of on a rail following along for the action. Now, he'll make adjustments to the receiver and safety and other mechanisms that he wants to push forward because they're not hard locked yet. But he's going with the Mosin-Nagant stuff, okay? So at the same time, this has been flipped around. Mosin and the rest of the team now have access to Nagant's magazine, and they get to play with it, not just attach it, but actually modify it and make their own improvements. Zakharov's next commission rifle did receive a magazine, but only 30 were produced, and the rifle was abandoned so quickly, I don't even have any data on it. The Mosin design by now was considered superior. Nagant would evolve his own design in stages, taking on more and more Mosin features. Notice the straight wrist to better fit Russian stock making, now fitted with a metal finger rest to give that same solid grip. The sights, barrel, and even basic shape of the receiver are getting more commission-like. The bolt is also very close to the Mosin pattern, actually favoring one of his earlier attempts, so essentially it was a step backwards. As for Mosin's rifle, well, we already saw the single-shot version, but here, fitted with a Nagant-styled magazine, it's starting to really take shape. The construction on the magazine was much simpler for the Russian arsenals, and he had actually added some pretty neat features. So that gun is so much like this one, I can just show you all over again. Again, check the chamber, pull the trigger, pull the bolt out, you got this down, right? So we're gonna look at the magazine. Zooming in, I want you to ignore this button. Instead, at this point, there's actually a lever arm that you would flick over, and then boom, you could open the magazine. Button comes later, but today we have the button. So pop that out. As I pull this down, I want you to ignore this follower. Instead, on the Mosin system at this point, this spring would be kind of flipped the other way and much thicker, and it would act as the feed ramp for the cartridges, kind of like how the original Nagant didn't even have this arm, it just had like a single big spring and a side arm. You saw the picture. All right, so what Mosin did is the ability to do this. Pinch and pull. That is pretty dang cool. I mean, you guys may or may not love the Mosin. That is pretty cool. And in a lot of ways, I think we're seeing over and over in this gun, Mosin's a very clever man. He's reducing parts. He's making good decisions. They're just not always the best decisions because he does not have a body of people around him that are pushing for absolute refinement. He's kind of a poor man's Nambu without the backup. All right, so this was pure Mosin. And then honestly, it made even more sense at the time because this little crossbolt here in the earliest guns would have been a sling swivel. So that part was already going to need to be there. And so that means that you're getting double utility all over again. And you don't need any extra fanciness to get this apart. Just a quick lever, and she's locked in by the backside of her own arm that already has to be there with a spring that already has to be there. This is really reducing the number of parts. It's really nice. Now, the Russians wanted a rimmed cartridge. So I happen to have some antique ammo laying around, and these have been, to the best of my ability, deactivated, but the bolt's over there, so you guys don't have to worry about anything on this one. So let's take a look at, well, we'll try to take a look at the interrupter / ejector that he designed inside the gun. So if you look carefully down in here, there's a blade. You see that? As a matter of fact, let me get my patented plastic. I would go ahead and start, taking the screws off of this thing and get the receiver out for you to see it even clearer. But Bruno's got the animation. It's going to be really easy to see there. So let's just do a light job of it here. When we load our round into the magazine, which, it would help to have an actual follower and everything to help make this not just fall straight through. There we go. When we load our round into the magazine, I can just pop that guy down. Sorry, trying to do it on camera. All right, you notice that he's held by this little blade of metal put in the right position so that the bolt will pick him up and feed him when I bring it back around. The problem you face with these rim cartridges is rim lock, just like we saw with the Lee Enfield. They had to address it, well, the Russians have to. So if you scrape these along each other, you're going to get the edge of this rim locked up against the edge of another one. It's going to tie up your whole magazine. So it's very important to be able to separate the next cartridge to feed from the second cartridge below it. And in this case, if I press down on this, what you'll see is this guy goes in and then he stops. And he's actually being held, and you could probably just barely see it out there to the side. I'm going to flip my pokey around so I can get it in there. It's a little notch right there. See it at the tip of the yellow? That notch is still part of one formed spring that is pressing in and holding that cartridge down. When the bolt comes forward and then turns into lock, it has to turn into lock. It will depress this little notch right here, which will allow that cartridge to pop up. Now, it's important that the bolt has to be all the way into lock, because remember, Mosin was challenged to prevent double feeds. So that means the next cartridge will not be picked up until this bolt goes all the way in, turns all the way down. At that point, we know the extractor has had a chance to lip over the rim of the cartridge that's currently in the chamber. So it doesn't have a controlled feed, but it does have a method of preventing the next cartridge from rising until you've locked it in. And then a lot of people in ownership circles have actually been confused about that, because they've sort of popped the bolt forward just to get the round loose, taken it out, and then they bring it back to get the next round, and they're like, oh, stupid thing's down there. That's because it's designed to not release the second cartridge until you're bolted all the way firmly on the first cartridge. It's a smart system to prevent double feed. It's just hard to understand if you're not used to it and you're used to a more organic system. So that means that that little spring in there, and it's an odd shape and you'll see it in the animation, but that thing is preventing the cartridges from flying out of the receiver. It is keeping this next cartridge down so that there's no rim lock. It's keeping the next cartridge down so that there's no chance of a double feed until, the first cartridge is actually lipped over the extractor. That is a lot of things for one little component to do, and then you add into the fact that it's shaped to act as the ejector. So when you extract the next cartridge, it rides over that, hits a heel that's shaped on there, and pops it out. Again, Mosin is combining a lot of functions into one part, and again, it's actually very intelligent. The execution is just weird, just alien. That is the heart of the whole Russian system so far. I know it doesn't execute well, and I keep saying that, but you have to, when you look at the history, start to appreciate what they were going for. It's smart. It doesn't mean it's good. Okay, so let's get back to the nitty-gritty. The big 1890s trials would involve 300 Mosin single shots, 300 Mosin magazine rifles, and was supposed to see 300 Nagant. But Leon could not keep up with production, and so this number was reduced to, I believe, about 100. They were tested by a combination of infantry and guard regiments, 4 in total. The troops were given surveys, and then they responded up to their officers, and then they sort of coalesced things, and we got, basically a 4-point trial. How did they fare overall? Well, 1 in 4 regiments preferred single-shot rifles to magazine rifles outright. I don't know what to do with this. Out of the magazine rifles, the Nagant was preferred. It was noted as feeling more like a finished gun and suffered from fewer feeding problems. They were offered 3 clips, one by Mosin, one by Nagant, and a holdover from Zakharov. Now, I want to point out, by the way, Mosin's guns were designed for the Zakharov clip. This was dropped last minute, and he forced his own clip into the design, and they worked terribly because they weren't actually designed for his own clip. That may have been why the Mosin was performing so badly. Regardless, the Nagant clips were preferred, but they were still a bit tricky to use without cutting yourself. They were also asked whether or not they'd like a handguard in the new rifle. It was universally agreed that they did in fact want a handguard. So, on the whole, it seems like the Nagant won. Alright, there's one problem with this. Well, 2 in a way. 1, I told you guys, the clips were not really set up the way they should have been. That can cause a lot of issues. 2, Mosin already knew that his 1890 rifle wasn't going to do as well in these trials, because he had already solved the problems that they found in this particular set of trials. He just solved it after the production of 300 started, and there was no way to stop and restart that production. Which is almost a shame, because while he was told he couldn't stop the 300 from going through, Nagant got to not submit 300. If Mosin had had that extra time or that extra attention, he could have switched and done his improved gun. So there's a bit of back and forth on this, but basically Mosin has a model 1890 plus. And most of this centers around improvements to the magazine that absolutely did prevent the feed problems that they saw in the trials. So yeah, now is when we see this final follower that sits on top of everything, and boy does it work. Also, the magazine latch was improved to what we see today in the modern Mosin. In a series of special demonstrations in March of 1891, this system handled very well and was also very good at single loading. So later that same month, they took the 30 Mosin 1890 pluses and the Nagants, and they put them into another set of trials, this time with basically 24 opinion makers. All right, now those 24 would try them again, and they would find in favor of the Nagant, 14 to 10. It's much closer, but the Nagant is still winning. So at this point, you're going to start saying, I don't understand. Why do we have the Mosin rifle if the Nagant kept consistently winning? Because we are right on top of the gun we have today. There's not really any differences between the 1890 plus and this final revision right here. It's going to come down to rubles. You see, the Mosin was made in Russia. So C&Rsenal already knew how to produce them, and they were effectively pre-tooled up. So production could begin months earlier. The Mosin also had a design built around looser tolerances. So who really knew what would happen when the Russian arsenals tried to take up the precision manufacturing of the Nagant? Even Leon couldn't produce it fast enough. Plus, both rifles were very complicated, so why add that extra expense of learning the new complicated rifle when we've already got this complicated rifle sorted out? And honestly, that would be the deciding factor. I mean, being 4 points up was not enough to risk all the inherent problems of possibly producing the Nagant when they already knew they could produce the Mosin. They got quite good at cranking them out already, and they already had all the tooling research to hand out to the other arsenals. It's a done deal. And the only changes that would follow are twofold. A slight modification to how the trigger retains that bolt, and a slight modification in how that weird combo ejector / interrupter is dovetailed and then screwed into place. That's it. Just cleaning up some loose ends, and then boom, you have the 1891 Mosin, which would be adopted in May 11th under the name 3-line rifle year of 1891. Mosin and Nagant, neither one of them got billing on this particular gun. And if you take a look, it doesn't quite look like this just yet. Just to summarize, we have a Lebel barrel and sights, a Nagant magazine and clip, a Berdan stock with slings, and Mosin's own designed bolt system, likely very distantly evolved from the Winchester Hotchkiss. Mix it all up and allow Mosin a fleet of other Russian engineers to keep cracking at it, and blammo, this is your guy. It's been a long road to the middle of the show, but we're there now. I can finally let you take a look at the inside of this 1891 Russian rifle. We'll start off by loading our rifle from a stripper clip. And as we do so, take a look at that interrupter. This part does a number of things, but right now it's being a feed lip. This component is both the trigger spring and sear in one simple part. This little extension on the top of the trigger actually acts as the bolt stop. And if I can turn your attention to the safety, it's as simple as can be. It merely keeps the gun from being able to drop the cocking piece. Alright, here's that interrupter from a better angle. Notice it is holding the next round in place until the bolt is locked. It'll also act as the ejector. Alright, I think this got us pretty well wrapped out, so let's get it over to Mae. Now, I know I left you guys hanging just a bit because where we ended on the development, the gun didn't look anything like this. Well, okay, it looked a little like this, but there are some pretty big differences. No handguard, funky thing down here on the wrist. So, what the heck happened to evolve that gun to this point? That's something that we're going to talk about in just a moment, but first, I also left out the bayonet. It was already decided by 1890, developed at C&Rsenal, the arsenal I cannot pronounce. The Russians would stay with a simple spike and collar. Interestingly, the bayonet was to be fixed at all times for combat. This came from Russian experiments revealing that the time it takes to fix a bayonet, especially one as weird as this one, would take up to 5 or 6 shots worth of time, making fixing the bayonet in battle a bad idea. Unless you just had a bayonet that was easy to fix. Weird reasoning. So the guns were sighted with the bayonets fixed on the barrels. Now, obviously, we did not have the bayonet fixed. I actually have an original, but it's missing the collar. It's not worth getting into. And at under 100 yards, it's really not going to be a big impact. Instead, this is the sort of thing that affects you out multiple hundreds of yards. And it does get very aggravating, though, if you don't know that the gun is sighted for the bayonet to be fixed to the gun. Because, by example, Serbia would end up with a little over 100,000 of these guys during the Great War, and they were not necessarily informed that the Russians were the kind of loons that go around with another extra 1.5 feet of bayonet hanging off everywhere they go. So when they started trying to use 1891s in various states of disrepair already, they found that they weren't hitting what they were shooting at. They had to take these weird angles and, Kentucky windage to get the thing sorted out. And in their minds, the guns were just improperly sighted or inaccurate, but in reality, it's the bayonet issue. All right, I'm getting a bit ahead, so let's walk back to talking about producing these bad boys. The Othais arsenal would be the first to see production. It started kind of in 1891, but things didn't really get rolling until the next year. Tula would also get going in 1892, and C&Rsenal, the arsenal I can't pronounce, would get going in 1893. Now, they should have been the first one out, you'd think, because they were so deeply involved in development, but they incurred delays helping the others tool up, I am certain. In order to more rapidly rearm their massive army, Russia would also contract with Manufacture Nationale d'Armes de Châtellerault for over 500,000 rifles. These were produced from 1892 to 1895. Now, rearmament would happen in 2 phases. The Russians favored frontline and active service troops ahead of everybody else. That's pretty obvious. And then they started kicking things down the line to reserves and specialty troops and all that stuff. And when you're dealing with something as large as the Russian land army, this is a big deal. It is a massive undertaking. Production was run hard up until 1903 to make it happen, and by then they would have 3,468,073 Mosin rifles, although this does include the Dragoon and Cossack models as well. I'll get to those in the next episode, like I said. So let's check back in with the inventors because somebody needs to get paid for all their hard work. Nope, not Mosin. Leon. He had received about 67,000 francs in payments to cover the actual production of the trial's guns. But now that his design, the magazine, had been adopted, it was time for him to cash out big on the licensing. His contract, as you recall, had stipulated that if his gun was adopted, he would get 200,000 rubles in exchange for those rights. There's a problem here, though. His gun was not adopted. All right, so this gets tricky because the contract had no stipulation for whether he got paid for part of his rifle. So the Russians really are thinking, what do we owe him? How much should this be? Blah, 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 and it's tricky because they still need the license to produce unless they just want to take it. I mean, they are their own government. Anyway, through private conversation, apparently with other officials, Nagant would make it known that he would be happy with 75,000 rubles for the magazine system. The Russians, true to form, like we've seen through this whole episode, decided that they wanted to save money, and so they sent a negotiator and they gave him a cap of no more than 50,000 rubles. This would have been fine if Nagant were up against just Russian production and therefore didn't really have a lot of negotiating space. I mean, arguably the Russians are building a case that Mosin did so much work on the magazine that they don't want to pay him at all. And there's some signs of the magazine moving very far away from Nagant's vision and how much he could really patent. So, okay. This puts Nagant on not very good standing, except for one problem that we just mentioned a moment ago, which is that they wanted the French to produce these guns. So yeah, because Nagant had had the sense to patent in France, they could get sued in France. And that cost from Châtellerault would be passed on to the Russians, and it's going to be a lot worse than the 200,000 rubles if it has to go through court. Add in the fact that they have to worry about, well, the actual production. They want it fast, and this could tie things up. So they got to pay the man. And instead of the 75,000 rubles that he had quietly made known, by this point, he's figured out this whole French production thing, and the cards are in his hand. He wants the whole thing. 200,000 rubles were paid to Nagant for the use of his magazine alone. Payday. This is why you invest in patents, and this is why you keep your head on straight if you are an inventor. The man made out just fine for his efforts. Anyway, what about Mosin, the man who really worked on the rifle? If Nagant got 200,000, what is this man getting? Well, obviously there would be plenty of rewards in the form of promotions and honors and medals, but cash money? Well, the commission would actually push for a 50,000 ruble payoff. That's not 200,000, but it's pretty good for, domestic pay. And the bean counters, well, they got that number down to 30,000 before it actually hit his hands. Still an impressive sum for those days in Russia, but geez, patents really pay. Anyway, Mosin would eventually head the C&Rsenal and rise to the rank of Major General. He would pass away in 1901 thanks to good old pneumonia. All right, now just because the inventor is dead, it doesn't mean that the rifle doesn't keep evolving, although some of it would happen before he passed away. Let's go ahead and work up how the Mosin gets from what we saw in that picture to this gun right here. All right, no handguard, a finger rest acting as a semi-pistol grip, and a unique swivel configuration. Soon that finger rest would be dropped, and a handguard finally added. You may recall this was recommended in the trials, but they didn't follow up on it until about 1894. After this, they would lengthen the cleaning rod, making it a bit more usable, and they removed that very far front swivel. We're not done yet, but we have to take a break because here comes the Russo-Japanese War. This fight kicked up over Manchuria and Korea. Japan's victory was complete and should have come quickly, but the Tsar kept dragging the engagement out. He was sure it would turn around for them, and then he was just trying to avoid embarrassment. This not only proved Japan's emergence as a world power, but it also shone a light on how badly Russia was in need of military reform. As part of all this, Russia came up against Japan's first smokeless rifle, the Arisaka Type 30. We actually have a whole episode on this repeater, particularly interesting because it would be a pretty common sight in Russia during the Great War. Now, comparing the Type 30 and the Mosin is actually pretty interesting because both guns are sort of commission designs. They're countries that were out of check, and then they reached out to find out what they could, and they pulled it in to get their gun. Now, the Japanese obviously went with a sort of Mannlicher Mauser influence. Those are good choices. That results in a fairly good rifle, although we've seen it has its limitations. For the Mosin, they went after the Lebel, which is not a bad idea for the barrel and cartridge, but for everything else, it's a bit tricky. And then, as we saw, they wormed in the Nagant magazine, which is an odd duck, and they wormed in sort of a Winchester Hotchkiss-y design, but not really, ultimately resulting in their own unique bolt that just sort of evolved organically. I'd argue that the Type 30 also has a fairly organic bolt in the number of parts and how it went together, so this is a really good two rifles to sort of pit up against each other to see who did the best at picking and choosing from the world stage. So let's line them up. Now these are Russian opinions. They found that the Mosin was heavier. The bayonet was more difficult to attach and detach, and plus it was awkward shooting and moving around with it always fixed. The Japanese 6.5mm cartridge was lighter and more convenient. Plus the recoil was much less severe. And its clip was easier to use, feeding more reliably. The Arisaka bolt was much smoother to operate, and the flush box magazine was less awkward and fed well without all the extra parts. The Mosin's ejector was often lackluster by comparison. Its barrel bands would work themselves loose after multiple shots, and the handguard itself was easier to damage than the Type 30's. Mosin cleaning rods were threaded, making them likely to strip or clog up with debris. The Arisakas were push-button and simple. Mosin's sling positions were uncomfortable and awkward, and the Japanese rear sight base seemed stronger, although the latter was technically a bit weaker than the Mosin's. That is a lot of negatives for the Russian rifle. Now here's the real kicker. The Japanese also assessed their own rifle after the war, although not necessarily in comparison to the Mosin, but rather they just looked for any and all vulnerabilities. And as we know from our other episode, they would end up with the Type 38. And oh man, is that one amazing military rifle, born of a desire to improve when they had already been winning left and right. This is kind of the attitude of the Springfield 1903. With the Russians losing so clearly, I wonder what they would come up with when they had to come to terms with the reality of their rifle not being what it should be. Now, I hate to ruin the excitement, but we already know this is what they're going to do. It's the same gun with some other bits. Good job, Russia. Japan beat your butt and then turned around and made one of the most amazing military rifles ever. And then you decided, yeah, we'll just do some more fiddly bits. Well, let's at least cover them for the folks at home. All right, here's where we left off. And now after the war, we're going to change the sling swivels to holes in the stock and add escutcheons around those. That way we can use the leather collar and carry the rifle a bit easier. These were already standard on the Mosin Dragoon rifles, but again, that's for the next episode. We'll also see a new sight thanks to new ammunition. This would be the Spitzer L cartridge. In 1908, Russia would follow along with Germany and the world by introducing their own boat-tailed Spitzer bullet. It provided significant performance gains, but required updating that rear sight. Previously, they had used a flat ladder like on the Lebel, but the new round needed new settings. Keeping the original sight base, they would adopt a neat but vulnerable design from armory worker Konovalov. Now, this thing was curved to allow the existing Arshin markings on the base to stay, making a very simple swap. Now, on the ladder, you could mark all new sights, and so that meant that they could pump up from the original 2,700 Arshins to 3,200. Still, that wasn't the only update necessary for the 1908 cartridge. So as we'll see, from 1909 to 1910, a number of minor changes appear to deal with the recoil of that new, more powerful round. You can't see it in this image, but the interrupter was adjusted to help feed the new ammo, and following the adoption of the new cartridge, the barrel bands would work loose even faster, and so they finally upgraded them to these rings. Also, a reinforcing steel crossbolt was added to help support the stock with the more aggressive Spitzer cartridge. Existing rifles were sent in for updates, but the process was cumbersome and slow. Many were not finished before the Great War. A big lesson from the Russo-Japanese War would also be that Russia needed a reserve. As short as the conflict was in what we consider the context of World War I and World War II, at that time, it was a significant conflict, and they were running out of equipment despite the incredible size of their empire. So they knew that for next time, they would need to have backups of everything, and they wanted a reserve of 4 million Mosin rifles. Now, this number would never be met, although they did get kind of close, ish. But 4 million really doesn't seem like the biggest number ever in the context of how big the Russian army really could be. This tells you what sort of conflict they were looking forward to. So, as we get into like the 19-teens, 1910, 1911, now starting to get into teens, the arsenals are idling down to like 7% of production. They're just barely staying on. And then, in 1913, with sort of everything rolling up to a boil, they go, it's getting a little conflicty out there. We don't have our 4 million rifles in reserve. Let's dial up production to like 12% of capacity. That'll really see us through. That will have us ready for when war were declared. All right, so that means that Russia goes into the Great War with about 3 million-ish rifles, 1891s. They would also manage to produce out of the carbines and dragoons and other stuff that we're going to talk about in the next episode, maybe another million more. but those are specialty. This is not for raw infantry. And besides, this is all basically a drop in the bucket for the attrition that we are about to see. Their peacetime army was roughly 1.4 million soldiers, so this doesn't sound too bad until you realize that over the course of the war, some 15 million would serve as things grew worse and worse. Russia would begin losing up to 200,000 rifles a month on top of everything else. It was pretty dire, and in fact, they had no real plans for forward depots and expected the already overloaded arsenals to handle repairs. It's getting really bad. As we saw in our Winchester 1895 episode, the Russian Minister of War would declare rifles more precious than gold when he had realized that they had over 1 million men without arms. Now, this is a long episode as it is, so I'm going to leave out how the Russians try to relieve this problem. I'm going to give you a hint though, it's contracts with everybody's favorite or least favorite country. Now, again, you're going to get a whole second episode on the Nugget. Anyway, how about opinions of the Russian soldiers? How do they feel about this particular gun? Here's the problem. Your average Russian soldier didn't get to choose his gun. He didn't get to try a different gun. This is all he knew. This was gun. And with the Russian Civil War and everything else going on, and the fact that this stayed in service with the Soviets, A, if people were writing down how they felt about it, B, they probably weren't being encouraged to share anything that was unpopular about what remained the service rifle for Russia for a very long time. So I don't have a lot of personal opinions. But I will say I've shot the gun. I've shot plenty of versions of this gun. I mean, they're everywhere. And I've shot a lot of other World War I firearms, and I will agree with the general consensus that this is one of the worst handling bolt actions of the conflict. Maybe the worst. It's got to be the worst. And we already talked about why. I told you about the forces in play. I told you about the air gaps and things like that, the vulnerabilities that Ian and Karl explored. It doesn't mean that the gun doesn't have some historical value. It doesn't mean that you have to hate it. It does kind of mean that you don't want to play with it every day. But that's beside the point. This is Russia's bid to do something like... Okay, this is going to piss people off. Comparable rifles to the Mosin-Nagant. Are you ready? The Arsaka Type 30, and part way into the 30, maybe like the 35, because there's some attempt to refine down in this gun. And then 2, the Lee Enfield. And I know I make people mad every time I mention that gun, but the Lee Enfield came in as the Lee Metford. They had to make all these changes because it was inaccurate. Basically, if the Russians did what they needed to do to this gun, this would have evolved like the Lee series of rifles did. If the British had just adopted the Metford and stuck with it with all its weird idiosyncrasies and inaccuracies and other problems, if they just said, no, we're going with this and we're never improving it, you would laugh at that gun almost as much as you laugh at this one, except for the fact that the core action was good. They built off of the problem, like they took the problems off and put features on to a good core action. And they were kind of lucky there was a good core action. The rim cartridge plays a big role in having a rear locking bolt like that, blah, blah, blah. It's a whole other argument for the comments. Go nuts. But the Mosin was built on an inherently flawed bolt. And I believe that the entirety of the flaw was the inclusion of that underside rail as the solution for everything. It seems like a tidy design. It just doesn't work. Mentally, great. On paper, great. You know, you show it to other designers and they go, oh, that's sublime. But then you actually start working the bolt and it's rubber. It's chewing gum. That is the problem with the Mosin, above and beyond anything else. Okay, so with all of that covered, let's actually go get Mae's opinion, not on the development or the comparison of it to like everything else in terms of evolution or history, but rather she puts it to her shoulder, she works the bolt, she pulls the trigger. How good or bad is the gun really? Okay, everyone, we've made room for Mae, and we have just enough room for this long rifle. I'll get that in your hands.
Thank you.
Now, once more, we're going to have to ask you for your opinion on how you felt working and firing this firearm. And I'm going to have to ask you to be a little professional on this one, because
I'm always professional.
We all know that every single American collector at this point has handled a Mosin to some degree. And so I'm sure you've experienced this gun many times over before filming this episode. So we're going to have to talk about it in the context we've talked about all the others. Are you going to be able to do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Come on, don't worry. I got this, guys. I got this.
Okay, so we'll start like we always do with the ergonomics.
First impressions. This gun is long, it is heavy, and it is not well balanced, guys. I mean, you really got to want to stick your hand further out past where you normally fit it. Like, it feels bizarre. I feel like I'm having to grip the barrel band up here for the right position with it. So that's a little bit awkward. It's thin-wristed, which is nice, but no semi-pistol grip. And I mean, I do know that on an earlier version, they actually added a finger rest on there made of metal. And I handled that up at the Springfield Museum. Hey, guys. And that was actually really nice. I appreciated that. It was in the right position just enough for you pull it back into your shoulder, and it gave you a good position on the rifle, I felt. But without it, there's really nothing for me to grip down here, so I miss that extra help. The comb, it's actually at a pretty decent height. It deposits my cheek weld right where it needs to be, right down the line of sight, so that's pretty good. The action. I've handled a lot of Mosins, and this one's actually pretty decent. It's in good shape. I mean, it's not a finished Mosin, which those tend to be the best, in my opinion, but it's still pretty good. And even that being said, it's still kind of rough. I mean, it feels like there's a lot going on there to it. And I want to point out, after firing a round, so let me just decock this for a second. There we go. Dang, you gotta treat it like it owes you money in order to open this guy up. It is stiff, so bear that in mind. Firing this rapidly is not going to be easy, and then also there's kind of a little bit of a bounce to it. I feel like if there's any sort of mud or muck that gets in there, it's going to be a little bit difficult to pop this guy open pretty easily when it kind of wants to like bounce a little bit. It's not really firm, so just keep that in mind. You want to make sure you keep these guys really super clean. Last but not least, the safety. It's stiff, but it's simple. I mean, I don't really use the safety that much except for, when we're obviously doing the shoot and the takes, but it's not a bad safety. It's simple, it's nice, it does the job. So, hey, I can't really complain. So yeah, ergonomics-wise, it's a little bit awkward and rough around the edges, but yeah, I think that's just Mosins.
I'm going to agree with May. Actually, may I borrow that?
Sure.
Thank you.
You may.
Anyway, the Mosin feels like it's 10 years behind itself. 1891, it should have had, there's that safety, by the way, clicking right back into place.
Right?
So maybe not the world's best safety for making sure that it's ready to fire again. Anyway, it feels a little outdated by the time it comes out. It's overcomplicated in a lot of ways, but that straight wrist, I can't get past it. And the worst part is they knew to put a finger rest there, and then they went, yeah, it's costing us another nickel. Get it out of there. And it would change the handling of the gun so much because
it's a nickel. Well, not really, but seriously.
We both handled one up at Springfield that had the rest. It felt great. Like,
yeah,
it's
it was
a
amazing.
Totally different animal when you can actually get it into your shoulder, and then it helps a lot with that muzzle heavy balance on this gun.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, that aside, for ergonomics, we had to really think about this gun before this episode, more so than usual. Normally we sit down, May and I have a quick conversation to cover. She tells me what she wants to cover so that I make sure we hit the points. This time around it was hard because we both grew up with Mosins to some degree.
It was like one of the first guns I ever shot, so.
Yeah, and so we were trying to figure out how to get this where we could describe it. And I think, May cover this a little bit, is how elastic that bolt feels is probably the most remarkable thing that we were totally accustomed to. But then had to stop and realize nothing else from World War I does that.
No.
Every other gun, if it's stuck on a case, you start putting power down on that bolt, and it either doesn't move, or it moves and opens. So if you want to force it open, once you get the bolt handle moving, this thing's going somewhere. This gun, more so than any other, I mean, like, several degrees of play where you hit it, and it goes up, and stops, and bounces right back down. Like just a big spring.
Yeah, you may as well, if you get it stuck, you may as well just get the mallet out and just expect to have a time there.
Yeah, and also just trying to keep firm, consistent pressure. Because as we know, when we're trying to apply that camming force into linear action, that primary extraction, we want a consistent, firm, like gear lever pull to get that case free. And in this case, we don't get it. We get this mushy, soft, lots of sort of like, I mean, there's some physics guys out there that could explain this better than me, but it just is not conducive to getting bad ammo out of the action. All right, so let me get this back to you, because speaking of ammo, we need to talk about actually pulling the trigger on this gun. What's it like shooting that full-length Mosin 1891? And I want to say full-length 1891 because we have another episode coming up after this in a few weeks, and there's some different models here. We're not judging them all in one basket.
Lining up my sights, and you know, they're not bad. They're a little bit busy. I feel like there's a little too much going on here on the sides. They kind of stick up a little bit into your peripheral vision, but overall, in between, it feels like I still have a decent line of sight. It's a good V-notch. Like, I really feel like it's not too bad there. I wish they could have maybe, like, taken a little bit of the extra metal off right here at the top just to kind of open your view up just a little bit more. The action we already covered. Loading rounds in there, I really didn't have any problems. Fed all 5 just fine for me both times. You just got to make sure you give it a good bit of force, tip it up a little bit, and push it on it with your thumb. And then firing. The trigger on this one is not the best. I mean, it's still, this, like I said, is a good, decent Mosin. This is in good condition. But that single stage trigger, it's mushy, and it's a long pull through. I don't know. It's just, I feel like they could have done a little differently there, and it would have worked out better. But you can actually just feel it all the way through, like it just creaking, and I don't know. It wasn't my favorite. The recoil. So yeah, I really wish again they'd had something down here to kind of help with that, pulling it into your shoulder, because there is a decent amount of recoil on this gun. And I mean, like I said before, we've shot Mosins well, a good bit of our lives now at this point. So I'm used to it, but when you really try to critically think about it, there is a significant amount of recoil with this gun, and there is a good bit of weight to the gun, so that does add to it, but there's still a good oomph to it that you definitely notice. And the concussive force, especially when someone shoots it next to you, is insane. And I'm smiling because I love it. It's something I do enjoy on this gun, but it is a bit much. And for firing in battle, that could wear on you for some time. But yeah, shooting wise, it is a pleasure. I do enjoy it, but with that trigger, it kind of brings it down a little bit.
Overall, I'd count that as a good impression, although I have one disagreement, which is that ammo feeds well or not, depending on the cartridge, depending on the case, depending on which Mosin you've got, depending on the humidity in the air. I don't know what it is, but those stripper clips either work or don't for me. Like, I either get them going or I don't. It always feels like the last 2 rounds always struggle to really set up to. But I will say, we've never, between the two of us, noticed rim lock on a Mosin. It seems like the interrupter system is working to prevent rim lock. I have repeatedly noticed Mosins just jam up on nothing.
Yeah, they'll jam for like no reason. I mean, you sneeze in the direction of it and it will jam, but it won't be from rim lock. You'll later notice and just like, oh, there was a little bit of grit in there, or oh, there's a little bit of rust in the chamber. Like everything else under the sun, but not rim lock.
Yeah, and then especially on feed, I've just found that combination interrupter, ejector, feed lip, that everything spring, once in a blue moon I end up with a cartridge that just jams straight into it and won't move. And then I have to smack it back down, yank it back, and then click it down, feed once, and then feed again to get it out. I don't know what it is, but I've seen it across multiple Mosins. It's just something that doesn't sit quite right in that system. I feel like when you've engineered a magazine to the nth degree like they have, you're bound to start chasing down to so many standard deviations of problems, and there's always going to be one more problem out there. They probably should have wiped it clean and gone with something else, but they didn't. This is what they have. All right, so feeding-wise, weird. And then we're talking about working the bolt icky. We're talking about recoil's a little severe considering, by the way, we've shot 30-06, we've shot other things. I'd call it very comparable to 30-06, by the way.
I mean, yeah, it's not that much different from it. I'll give it that. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because the Mosin just always feels bigger than what it actually is, maybe. That's it.
To be fair, ergonomics can play a part of that too. They do have it here. Lift that guy up for a second. They do have it's a scalloped butt plate, but it's also pretty sharp at the edge. It's very wide and square. So maybe that plays into it, but I do agree. It does feel, even though I should have roughly the same recoil impulse with an appropriately sized Mosin and maybe like a 1903, I don't know why the Mosin always feels just a little bit more severe, and it has that thicker bass note. But all of that rolled in together, and we're disregarding the rimmed cartridge at the moment because this is not an automatic, so the rimmed cartridge with a good interrupter system doesn't bother this gun. Do you feel like you would be content to take something like this into battle?
You know, guys, the Mosin is one of my favorite guns, personally, as a collector. I own an M91, so they're great. I love them. I don't know if I bet my life on them, because realistically, we've listed a whole slew of problems. Any modern muck that gets in the action, it'll jam up pretty easily. And the weight balance on that isn't great. Trying to cycle this action when you're on prone, I can't imagine doing that when, it's after firing every round. I mean, firing 100 rounds of this, I feel like would really wear on you throughout the day. I just don't know if by the 99th round, I'd feel comfortable defending myself with this gun. So, as a collector, yeah, I love them. I want to keep them in my life forever. For defense or offense, I don't really think this is the guy for me.
I am going to have to agree with May. When we take in the totality of this rifle, may I borrow it? The 1891, this Mosin, not the 9130 that's at your house. Don't take this personally. Let's add it up for just a second. It's big, heavy, and a little unbalanced. We have not as good wrist control as we'd like. Yes, we can get over it, and there's plenty of straight wrists that we did get along with just fine. But add into the fact that you have, not the strongest handguard. We haven't even talked about this yet, but these are actually pretty easy to beat up on. They're clipped in a lot like the Remington Model 10 shotgun, and we had a lot of problems getting that thing to stay together. This one's very tight, but I've seen lots that weren't, and you've seen a bunch of these broken. So, handguard's not all there. The bayonet has to be fixed all the time if you factor that in. We didn't even fix the bayonet for shooting.
We didn't even try it.
No, we just took some Kentucky windage, and still, you ended up high. We could have just shot again with a 6 o'clock hold, and it would have been fine, but we kept it. We're in a hurry trying to get other stuff filmed. You can, under 100 yards, you can sort of just eyeball it in, but I'm going to tell you, you start reaching out to 200, 300, whatever, you're going to be way off your sight. You're going to be having to pick, what tree to shoot at to hit the bush to the other side. So I don't know that I'm a big fan of a gun that's designed around having that gigantic bayonet. Because again, but no bayonet right here, already muzzle heavy. Add the bayonet on top of it. We're taking a better case than what was actually issued. So even ignoring the bayonet issue and treating it like it was sighted without it, muzzle heavy, worst bolt so far. I mean, I always like sort of playing devil's advocate with these guns, but most people will claim that the Mosin has the worst bolt, and out of World War I, it probably has the worst bolt. There's bolts that are from single shot black powders that are conversion guns that don't hold up as well, but actually most of those even hold up better than this. It's not there, it's too loose, it's too soggy, it's too rubbery. And so I think it all comes down to, I would definitely take a Mosin if I got to hand select my Mosin. You give me a rack of 50, let me get a few rounds out of them, pick the one I like. I would actually trust that, because that would mean that I'd found one that was manufactured a little tighter than the other ones. And the cartridge is powerful. The gun is really cool. Most of us, this is our first full-powered cartridge here in the U.S. collector's market. So a lot of us have fond memories of that first thumping beat coming out of this thing. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, if you're issuing them, if somebody's rolling up in a truck and they're just here, this is yours, you're going to defend yourself with it. I'm not feeling so good about that. I'd much rather pick it myself. So I'm going to have to agree with a soft no to maybe even a firm one, depending on which one you gave me. But at least that wraps up our show. Is there anything else that you have to add to this?
No, not really. I'm sad that it didn't get a yes for defense or offense, but at least it gets a yes in my personal collector book.
All right. Well, stay after the credits for updates, and thank you for tuning in. We will get through the rest of these guys on the next episode.
Bye, guys. That guy, right there. See him? He wants to stop right there. Blue guy sucks. That's one update.
I mean, he's not as fast as the red one, but he's trying his best.
Anyway, also on one of our videos, we finally hit 1 million views. Live fire the Lewis gun. Cool.
I really wish it was one of our actual episodes, but they lag so much further behind than the really easy clickbaity stuff. So
I'm just proud of us. We did a good job. We're almost at 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I wonder if we'll hit it before we get walked off the platform, apparently.
God.
I know there's a lot of drama about that, by the way. So far, I haven't seen anything that says that we're going under, but I've also seen a lot of comments about networks dropping gun shows, so honestly, guys, I don't know. I'm backing up the show to multiple places. You can always check with us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and...
Facebook?
Yeah, we have Facebook.
Yeah.
Okay. I said Facebook.
Oh.
Okay. Anyway, you can find us on social media. You can go to C&Rsenal.com. You can always find the show. I will always have it somewhere. I've got a BitChute that I'm slowly uploading to. It's just that already I got one episode out of order, and there's no way to rearrange them. So it's just a complete... My OCD is kicking in. So I'm trying to move episodes up. I can't rehost at every possible site you want me to because there's just a limit to how much bandwidth I can burn through before they start capping me. I mean, it is ridiculous down here. So the show will go on. Everything's fine. And that's because we have always relied on our patrons. So if you like the show, if you're worried about the show, if you want to take a little bit of pressure off of me and you like what we're doing, head on over to Patreon, kick in $1. I mean, we have about 22 to 24,000 regular viewers. We have almost 100,000 subscribers, but, you know, the people who turn in for every episode, a little over 20,000 people. $1 from all of them, and I would not have to sweat anything. I could hire an editor. I could hire all this stuff. I could get everything in.
Oh, yeah.
We could have custom dies being worked here. Like, I could do all this stuff instead of, like, right now where I rely on a lot of kindness from strangers because this show is very top-heavy. And then on that regard, I'm going to hopefully find an easier topic for the next episode after the Mosins because I kind of overdid it. I think I've been pulling over 100 hours easy for the past 4 weeks trying to get the BAR and the Mosins together. Now, of course, by the time you're seeing this, we'll have another Mosins episode out for you in 2 weeks. So 4 weeks from now, you might have a lighter duty episode that's more like 20 to 30 minutes long if I can find something that fits that time scale. Wish me luck, because I need just a day off, please. All right, with all that, I appreciate all this support. I appreciate that you guys are worried. Maybe not asking me the question of where we're going individually in email over and over again, because that's a lot. But I appreciate the concern, and it will always be available. We are not going to be wiped off of all social media at once. That would be ridiculous. All right. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for all of your help.
Thanks, guys. I'll turn the penguins back on. Yeah! Penguins.